yes, this panel is really just about giving you a historical groundwork that will sort of frame the rest of the day. And I basically am going to start with a question for each of them, and when they answer the question, they can also introduce themselves rather than being doing a bit of a laundry list. But I wanted to start with just a tiny bit of history. I was asking John Rubinstein, the former senior vice president of hardware, who worked obviously at Apple, but worked with Steve Jobs for a good 16 years, where he thought modern NPI came from. And I mean, I should probably emphasize this is a bit of a single source anecdote, so whether you take this as gospel truth, I'm not sure. But he really traced it to the beginnings to being at HP in the early 80s. And then he and Glenn Moranker and sort of industry legend Gordon Moore were at Ardent Computer, sort of a workstation group that never really made it, but had some influence. And after Ardent, Glenn Moranker and John Rubinstein went to Next, the Steve Jobs company, and continued to develop and evolve these processes. And then Next, of course, didn't really make it. But a sort of forgotten story is that the remnants of Next hardware became Firepower. And Glenn Moranker went over to Firepower and sort of brought these processes, modern NPI, there. And then Motorola acquired Firepower. So it sounds like that's how we get from HP through Gordon Moore at DEC, bringing in ideas from Xerox, going to Ardent, going to Firepower, and then going to Motorola through Moranker. And then both Moranker and Rubinstein, around the times of Steve Jobs coming back, go to Apple. So as far as I can tell, that is sort of how we get from the Motorola way, but sort of in tandem, in a sense, going to Apple as well. But we have someone here who spent 9 years at Motorola and worked on the Razr. This is Felix. So I would love for you to start and tell me where I got things wrong and take us off.
So I'm Felix Alvarez. I'm a mechanical engineer, senior manager at Second Order Effects, but one of the claims to fame, Motorola, Apple, Google, Meta, and Amazon. Microsoft didn't get there. But basically, I worked at Motorola back when MPI started, and I will let my colleagues introduce themselves, and I hope to give you some history as to how we actually modified some of the initial MPI philosophy.
I'll give you 3 minutes, actually, to go through Motorola Way a little bit.
Okay, so yeah. Actually, sorry about that. So the Motorola Way is, everybody knows about Six Sigma and how that started. But one of the key things that happened basically 2 years after I started at Motorola was there was a big gap between the design direction and components versus what it would cost to manufacture. So there was a pivot in Motorola. It's like, we need to bridge that. So how do we bridge that? They actually made development own the budget up to DBT, which created a pretty interesting aspect for engineers, because now you needed to understand how parts cost that much. So from setups to CNC tools to how you do injection molding, casting, all those became part of your daily design routine. And that started kind of like the basis as to how Apple understood how to actually go beyond just the design, go into truly the sourcing, the manufacturing, understanding to the point of percentage points, like cents, how much a part will cost to be made, or how much a part will cost in actuality to hit your targets and your business targets for the product.
Great. And then, so Matt can sort of introduce the Apple Way. Anna says you have this great one-sentence, one-liner on the Apple Way, but you can go beyond that.
A little bit more. I spent 14 years at Apple, stopped at Samsara afterwards, and right now I'm at Snap. And when I think about the Apple Way and what characterizes it, the two things that stand out are relationships and resources. So on the first point, people think about products at Apple and they think about, Johnny Ive, Steve Jobs, those two names. What they don't realize is that, and this blows a lot of people's minds, is that there are no product managers at Apple, which is just bonkers by most company standards. And what you have instead is a very, very tight-knit group of folks who have just been in it together, developed really deep, close working relationships. And at the end of the day, there's this very tight-knit group that is making the decisions in close coordination based on relationships built, in the office, on the ground in China, et cetera. And you see this at the working level. You see this in the promotion process that they've instituted. And you see this at the very highest ranks of the company You look at the sort of the C-suite at Apple, it's an incredibly long tenured group who's been working together that entire time. So those relationships really underpin a lot of what makes the company work. And then the second thing is resources. So to say it's a kind of a truism that like Apple resources are not really an issue is pretty obvious, but that really only applies to development. At the end of the day, customers are cost sensitive. There is sort of a check and balance there. But on the development side, when you amortize your tooling, your travel, all of that over 100 million units, everything goes to zero. And in that list, I would focus on the travel actually as sort of being the dark horse difference maker for Apple. Because when you put a plane load of engineers over to China, and I think at one point we were like some ungodly portion of United's revenue. When you put a plane load of engineers over to China, and my peak year, I spent over 100 days on the ground in China. That is a lot of time to be that close. And when you're that close to the fabrication, the manufacturing, you're running this incredibly tight feedback loop with the vendors. You're running this incredibly tight feedback loop on the products. And you're developing those engineers into craftspeople. You are getting the reps in that really teaches you about the product. And that sense of craftsmanship is, I think, one of the things that really defines the Apple way.
Okay, and so we can move to Zach. So what's fascinating about what Matt just said and why Zach is such a key person to have next is you're sort of trying to take the ideas of the Apple way, right, and do it at a startup. But taking into account what Matt just said, right, like you're not amortizing to zero, building 200 million products a year, right? So how do the lessons actually work at a startup?
Sure. So my name is Zach. I'm the head of hardware at Backbone. We're one of the fastest growing consumer hardware companies of all time. So we're growing faster than Fitbit, Aura, and Ring right now. And I used to work actually at Apple for a far shorter amount of time than Felix and Matt, but I was on the iPhone team. And I got a chance to experience a taste of what that really meant. And so everything I'm going to say and what I've been working on developing for the next way at Backbone is really built and owes a huge debt to Matt and people like Felix who have come before and really shown us how to build incredibly great hardware. But the challenge for what we're facing today is I personally believe there is a new wave of hardware coming, like a revolution that we haven't seen for 20 years. And if Motorola dominated from 1990 to 2010, right, the flip phone era, Apple has been dominating, right? Maybe from about iPhone, 3G, 2010, perhaps until 2025 or 2030. There is going to be a coming revolution, and those companies that succeed and dominate there will be based on a completely new process. It has learnings from the Apple way and the Motorola way, but it's uniquely formatted to be suited for really three key things. And those three key things are speed, speed, and speed. And the reason why that everybody talks about speed, right? Like we love speed, right? But time is the only truly valuable resource. Like this is an Elonism, right? Who kind of pioneered a lot of this rapid iteration. When you have time, if you can make more time, right? You can use that time on more iterations. You can spend it on creating more features for your product. You can spend it on developing those products faster, getting them to market before your competitors. You can use it to de-risk and do additional testing to make your product more reliable or be able to go into more markets. Or you could even use it to optimize for cost, right? Have a reduced, smaller team that iterates faster. And that speed, mandate has been enabled by three key things that have changed in the last 5 years. The first one is radically powerful SLS 3D printing. So I used to be at Formlabs, which is a 3D printing manufacturer that has dominated this industry. You can now, for about $15,000, get a state-of-the-art machine that can produce ready-made prototypes, up to 4 per day, with a minimum of training. The second thing is commoditization of subsidized hardware from companies like Apple. So, when Matt was there working at spending billions of dollars on this new technology, like cameras, microphones, speakers, that tech has trickled down and is now available to everybody, even startups like us. And lastly, it's the diversification and accessibility of excellent vendors who are extremely well trained in cranking out top quality products that consumers have come to expect with a minimum amount of input from US-based teams. Again, those are vendors that companies like Apple and Motorola, Matt and Felix, have helped train. And so there is this unique moment right now where if companies and startups can have the right philosophy, culture, and values, they can take advantage of those enablers and use them to develop hardware 10 times faster and 10 times cheaper than the traditional way, which is going to be incredibly critical when you're moving so quickly with the new technologies and this next wave of hardware that's coming.
Great, and I want to come back to SpaceX, another company you were at, because not at the moment, but just like it's such a fascinating company. I would love to know what the process there is like as well. Okay, if I come back to Felix, could you just talk about whether the Motorola Way is still relevant, and what are the sort of pitfalls of the Motorola Way?
So Motorola is still around in a sense of how to develop parts at a cost. So the DFX concept, which is cost, reliability, assembly, all these things that people apply, that started at Motorola early. And then how it's actually modified is, it was very rigid when we were there. We were told you have to follow all these things. We have all this data and it has to match that data set. That started killing innovation. And that innovation is part of the reason that ultimately they fell behind, because you have to break some eggs basically to make an omelet, right? So for you to be able to take the necessary risk for the consumer to see value in your product, you can't just be rigid about your system and your process. And that's one of the problems, that they got so obsessed with their process that they forgot to innovate.
And Matt, this sounds so much like Apple. Is that unfair?
In terms of what breaks with the Apple Way, right? 'Cause that's the core of it. The focus on relationships and the focus on craftsmanship, there's a risk there that, one, you have this incredibly tight-knit group of people. It's very hard for new voices to break into that. And I think that may be a component in sort of the ideas that you see coming out. Secondly, that craftsmanship focus means that you will spend an endless amount of time polishing. That means you don't always bring things forward for that feedback loop with the customer that you might as quickly as you might otherwise. And when you couple that with the resource-heavy investment, it creates a lot of sort of headwinds to bringing out the next thing and continuing to progress. It's very good at innovating or iterating. It's struggling maybe a little bit at scale to innovate.
I have a question for you on that. Do you think that that's changed since you started? Because you've been there since basically the early days of this new version of Apple, right? Was it always like that, or was it originally something that was a lot closer to that iteration, innovation,
It's
risk?
definitely something that evolved over time. I mean, I remember when we were doing Touch ID, we parallel pathed a home button, traditional, and like a brand new fingerprint sensor. Let's stick this like crazy 2 megahertz sensor in the middle of our antenna, strobing wildly at 20 volts. Great idea. But we carried that all the way through to EVT. We tooled full, basically chin subassemblies for both designs. That's the kind of thing that you would not do now. So there was a greater appetite. I think also, though, just the profile is higher. The stakes are higher.
Can I ask if the Vision Pro, and I don't have any knowledge that you worked on it or anything, but does the Vision Pro prove the case that Apple's struggling with innovation, or is it the exception that actually is indicating that they can go beyond just iterating an iPhone?
I did not work on the Vision Pro. It is a technological tour de force.
Yeah.
I think the question is delivering customer value. It is very good at everything it set out to do. It is unclear, I think, to the customer why it deserves $3,500 of their own hard-earned dollars.
Yes. Can I ask about what's been called to me the pyramid structure at Apple? So this is really going back to the 2000s, but I'd love to know if it's still relevant. And I'm asking because it's on your LinkedIn profile. Now, you don't call it the pyramid structure, but what I'm talking about is industrial design at the top. So obviously, Johnny Ive gained a sort of like almost like godlike, presence at Apple, where what he said, the phrase that was given to me was you'd have to drive off the cliff to show that the brakes don't work. In other words, if you were coming to Johnny Ive saying something didn't work, you damn well better have the evidence. Then it would go to product design. Product design would make sure all the mechanical engineering works. They would throw it over to the manufacturing design engineers, and then those guys would throw it over the fence to ops. Except that it's also been told to me that like the fence was also removed, and as much as these sort of sound sequential, it was all happening simultaneously, which sort of bends the mind a little bit. But trying to do that at a startup, are you sort of instituting that same thing where like what ID says is like gospel?
We are ID. What I could say is we are ID and ergonomics driven and engineering led. And I think that is actually a distillation of what Apple has done. One of the biggest innovations that Steve Jobs and the executive team at Apple did was they created a new role called the PD engineer. And again, Matt and Felix were some of the first people to be in that role. But traditionally, and I'd love to get your opinion on this, Felix, at Motorola, there was like mechanical engineers. They did mechanical engineering design, and then the ID people built a shell around it, right? And it was like all about the engineering, which is great, except the ID team came along and Steve Jobs was like, these people are closer to the customer. They're not technical, right? But they can have that vision and genius. So let's have them set the stage and the direction, but then create this role that's almost a super engineer. Mechanical design background, but they also can do quality engineering. They can do program management. They're product managers. They can develop the future of what those products are, working with the ID team. And most importantly, those PD members are executives in their own right. They do have the ability to command thousands of people around the world to make billion-dollar decisions. And in some cases, those people are like new grads. It's a level of power that I've never seen before. And when I was leaving iPhone, some people told me, you will never again have as much power as you did when you were an iPhone PD engineer. It doesn't matter how successful your startup is, because you can command armies around the world. You have to have a very specific culture and level of trust to do that. But if you can pull it off and you have talent that is truly that good, you can achieve things that nobody else in the world can get close to.
Yeah, and to answer that question, so Motorola started with the term physical design. And that's what we were known for, and that's what actually Steve Jobs respected. He actually mentioned in a couple of books or articles. So a 28-year-old managing a $5.7 million program up to DVT, that's the kind of stuff that Motorola did that started this physical design to product design engineer, where you become the CEO of that part. You're making decisions that can cost Apple, Motorola, whatever, $16 million if you make a mistake. So those are the kind of power that now you became more in tune with understanding that the product is not about the engineering feat, it's about the person that uses it and how they interact with it and how they see value. So those were, I think Apple took it to the next level. Motorola used to be about, it has to be reliable as hell. Apple was, it has to wow the customer, it has to be intuitive. They want to use this product.
And so Apple's strength really is execution. And I don't believe there's any reason to think they've lost an edge there. But how fundamental is like the changes we're discussing to its ability to execute and others' ability to execute?
I'll take that one, Matt.
So when you talk about execution at Apple, I think the biggest headwinds that we have there are, I talked a lot about craftsmanship as sort of a core value. It's very in line with the design DNA of the company. And over the last, from 2020 to 2023, we had an entire cohort, Zach among them, who didn't have that opportunity to go to China and spend that time on the ground. There is we talk about it with, our kids in school. We're seeing that in the young engineers, that they haven't asked an operator to get up in their, terrible Mandarin, moved them aside, sat down at the fixture, understood the datums, understood the operations, how it feels right-handed versus left-handed. There's that tactile experience of being on the line that I think is going to be, there's a deficit there that will impact Apple's ability to execute. And frankly, I think one of the things that I saw and that I hope is changing as they get back into Asia in a physical way is designed by DOE. This sort of shotgun approach versus, the intuitive engineer who, cuts straight to the answer because they've seen this, they've done this, they know this. On my team, I had every single person go and do an entire phone start to finish, moving station by station down the line to fully appreciate what happened on the line and getting back to that and closing that feedback loop, I think will be key to continuing to execute. But that is not the expectation of sort of the youngest parts of the workforce.
So my mind was blown a few months ago by a conversation I had where I had just made the assumption that COVID was this big interruption, but then now that COVID's over, there would have been a resumption of sort of the old model. And I'm specifically referring to for an iPhone launch, I'm told you'd have 300 to 500 people flying in from Cupertino to really help with that launch, and that it's fallen to about 30 to 50. My assumption was that we'd be back to the 500, and I'm told that's not the case at all. And there's actually considerable angst about that because the team in China is taking on considerable more power, and in a sense, the secret sauce of Apple, I mean, not that there's just one, but has always been the sort of back and forth, the close iteration between headquarters and China. I don't know if anyone can validate that, but how problematic is it if that change has been made? Because it sounds like it's deliberate rather than, something to do with COVID and not allowing to be able to fly there.
I mean, I left in 2022, so I have not been there for the last 2 product cycles.
Sure.
My understanding, though, is that it is ratcheted back significantly, and that goes across other teams as well. Teams where, typically they'd be doing 3-4 trips a year. Previously, now they might be doing 1 a year or 1 every other year.
What does that signify to you, though? To me, that sounds like a big problem.
Loss of craftsmanship.
Yeah.
It's that disconnect. That said, the partners in Asia, as Zach alluded to, they turbocharged during COVID. They were given an opportunity. They rose to the occasion almost unanimously across the board.
Yes.
There is that vendor base, but there is something lost on the design side if you don't have that grounding.
Yeah. Go ahead, Felix.
And I want to kind of double click on that because the problem is you don't know what it is to break a setup on a CNC unless you witness it and see the steps that it takes, the time it takes, how it adds cost to that part. And Apple basically, I would say, single-handedly brought up the capacity of CNC across the world by scale that we have never seen before. At Motorola, it's like if you had a CNC part or a second operation, you will get fired. It's like, no, it has to be an injection mold, it has to be casted. And I want to kind of also, the craftsmanship that Matt is referring to, I still remember a time when we had a colleague of mine, Emery, that he probably remembers, jet black hair, blue eyes, he spoke Mandarin. There was a complaint by one of the line people about the design, and because he spoke Mandarin, he understood it. We didn't understand what it was. He injected himself in there, wrote down, it's like, no, this is the way we think and the person gave a back and forth of about 15 minutes until Emery went back and said, we need to redesign this. This is not going to work if we want to get to millions of parts.
Wow. So if I'm allowed to plug my book, it's very much about sort of putting Apple's history into a geopolitical context wherein there is that loss, but of course there's not just the loss of that sort of model or approach, it's also a gain on China's side where they've become amazing at this sort of stuff. Can you just introduce SpaceX, just because it's such a fascinating company, and I would love to know sort of how it interjects into this discussion.
Sure. So I interned at SpaceX back in 2015, and this was a time when if you were an intern there, you literally were an engineer because they were so understaffed, and it was just like the day before I started was the Flight 20 explosion, which was the first failure of a Falcon 9 rocket. So I was incredibly excited to be. I was like so happy. And the first day of work, Elon just yelled at the entire company and was like, you guys, if you blow it one more time, this company is over. I expect everybody to be getting down and basically committing themselves for the next whatever year to making this rocket successful. So I got a really unique experience where even as an intern, they were like, you're now redesigning and owning the liquid oxygen to turbopump bolted joint, which was carrying liquid oxygen at negative 350 degrees Fahrenheit, 3,000 PSI, and this rocket engine that was basically like catching on fire. And I was so underqualified to do that role. It was hilarious. But, I figured it out, and that's shipping today, right? And it's pretty cool. So what I saw when I was there is their biggest strength is there is no reasonable expectation of anything. Apple has a bit of this too, but it's factored in a different way. At Apple, there's no reasonable expectation of having high risk. It's like you will de-risk this no matter what, and there is no excuse for anything below that. At SpaceX, it's you will create this performance feature that is 100 times better than anything else anybody's ever seen, and I don't even want to hear any kind of excuse as why that's not possible. So an example the SVP of propulsion once told me was Elon told him, we need to drop rocket engines in 24 hours. Okay, traditionally takes 2 weeks. When you have a mandate that is that insane, it requires you to throw everything out the window that you thought that you knew and then design something from scratch. Like he was like, maybe we can use magnets. None of that's gonna work. In the end, it looks kind of like what exists today, but throughout the process, you hit upon a couple key innovations that radically change everything. So when I'm looking at like Backbone and blitzed hardware, which is like the philosophy that I've brought there to develop this hardware faster, you have to start from scratch and really set your goals to be so far outside of the range of what you think is possible that it requires you to reinvent everything from scratch. You cannot do that at companies like Apple because you have a massive machine that has to keep cranking out hundreds of billions of dollars with a geopolitical context every single year, right? but you can do it in startups, especially startups that don't yet have the expectation of having to deliver that quickly. And one of the funniest stories when I was there as an intern, I had this part, I had to ship it, right? I put it into the machinist. They told me it would take 4 weeks. I come back 3 weeks later, and all of a sudden the lead time is 4 more weeks. And I'm like, wait, what's going on? And the answer was, you're an intern, so your stuff gets bumped down. You're never gonna get your part made. So I went back the next day and I brought these welders and machinists 2 boxes of the best donuts I could find in LA. And I just said, I didn't ask them to make the part. I just said, I really appreciate it. They've been helping me out, giving me advice. I really appreciate it, guys. Part was ready 3 days later, right? So what does that mean, right? It doesn't mean that you follow the rules. It means that no matter what it takes, you have to reinvent the rules of the game to hit those ridiculously insane goals that everybody else tells you are not possible. And that's what I would say is the biggest distillation of the SpaceX way.
Go ahead, Felix.
You're bringing me back. I used to bring bagels to the machinists at Apple so that they could actually work on my parts. So it works.
That's funny. All right, we've got a couple minutes left. I would love to just get more distillation, I suppose, from you two, just about like what the next way is. And I don't know that we're working with like a universal paradigm, or whether it's completely dependent on the product, the industry, the scale.
So I think the biggest thing is, and I think Zach alluded to this, we have to move faster. Additive manufacturing has added an additional layer where you can get things faster and learn faster. We need to apply those things into the product development process in a different way that current big companies do, because those processes are slowing them down. One of the things that I tried recently on a startup is try to build a robot in 2 weeks. Everybody told me it was impossible. We were able to do it. Full robot for certain thing that I cannot talk of. But those things were like, no, it's going to take you 6 months to do that robot. We did it in 2 weeks. So that paradigm in reapplying some of the processes that have the positives, but build it at speed, and at speed that nobody has seen or heard of, with the manufacturing technology that we have now, AI, all these things. Like, I got to give a plug here to Anna with Instrumental, being able to inspect real time. Those things are enablers that engineers need to be using now for the next way. They can be back in the Apple or Motorola way. Those are constrained by certain things that are not going to propel us forward in manufacturing.
Is the level of software iteration like a plausible goal for hardware?
I've been trying that. Everybody's told me to apply an agile framework to hardware. That is not possible. I tried it twice. But you can apply some of the concepts of the agile framework in terms of how you iterate in hardware and iterate with risk in mind. That can get you there.
Okay, Matt?
So I'm only 3 months into my new role at Snap, and Snap does not have the resources that Apple does, but it does have the ambition. And one of the things that I think defines how and why we think we can be successful there is that we have these great vendor bases that we talked about. We have tools that, we have plenty of Forms Labs printers, guaranteed. But we have the ability to de-risk things early. And rather than DOE by a shotgun approach, it's like, let's take smart bets, let's prototype them quickly, let's prove them out. I think that fast feedback loop and the ability to do it not just in China, because that's where you had to go to run that feedback loop before, we can run that feedback loop here. And I think that's a key element in being able to punch above your weight as a hardware company.
Could you discuss just being at a startup? To what extent are you sort of preaching to the choir? Like, I guess it's unclear to me as a humanities graduate. Like, to what extent are all engineers on board with what you guys are saying versus I guess what I'm noticing is there's a lot of agreement, right? It's not like a vociferous fight between the 3 ways. But I don't know if this is like a representative sample. So maybe discussing it at a startup. When you're launching this NPI approach at a startup, are you working with a team of people that are coming out of Caltech and MIT and they already know all this? Or are you sort of having to teach them the lessons from your career and getting them on board?
The best talent we found are the people who don't know it yet, but then we've brought on and grown, right? So folks like Felix and Matt, they do get it, right? But the really great talent is the talent that's going to be great 10 years from now, right? That are coming up on this. And I mean, when we look at, what we're trying to do at Backbone, which is scale this company into the hundreds of millions of units, right? There is a new crop of founders and executives that are working on this. I mean, I have on my phone right now a secret signal group that has 42 people that are working on founding hardware companies and scaling up the ones that already exist that are all using this blitzed hardware framework that you guys know about. But the difference is those founders and excellent hardware engineers, they aren't adopting it with the constraints of what everybody else in this room is already dealing with. And the question that I have for anybody that's in that position of being established is, how many of you are ready to uproot your entire established hardware development processes and replace them with something that's radically different? Because these new hardware founders, they are doing that right now, and they don't have the expectations that all of the established companies have. And they're born into that new philosophy. So once they get that flywheel going, which isn't gonna be 10 years from now, it's gonna be more like 2 or 3 years from now, they're going to be unstoppable, because just like you pull in that new hire that has got a great background but doesn't know this way of doing things yet, those companies will scale up and they will be unstoppable once they hit that velocity.
And Matt, can I ask you? I mean, if we're, I think it was Felix who talked about these models being outdated, right, and needing something new. I don't know if you have the institutional knowledge, but like, does Apple get that? Are they themselves changing, or are they sort of all right, set in their ways? Like, to what extent does there need to be like a radical departure from what Apple's doing now or in the last few years in their approach to NPI?
I feel like you're going to get me in trouble with a lot of people. No, I mean, my primary scope within Apple was in the iPhone team, which, I mean, that is the goose that lays the golden egg. And there, you know, I think the risk tolerance that, you know, Zach alluded to is very, very real. You know, whenever you're doing things at that scale and in those product cycles, delivery and execution is everything, and that's not the place you're going to take that risk. I think that, you know, you risk staying on that path too long, which I think Zach has made a strong case for. As far as how they do that in, shall we say, other areas, you have to ask those folks.
Okay. I think we can wrap up, but I don't mind if each person wants to have like a final comment. Do you feel like doing that? Felix, is there anything you want to sort of wrap us up with? Advice for the next generation?
Advice from the next generation, I would say, of engineers is dump the sunk cost that comes from history, learn from it, but use your mind to explore beyond that, including the fact that I would say something that I got taught very early in my career. I was 22 years old. Chief engineer at Pratt & Whitney Engine said, if it doesn't violate the laws of physics, why not try it?
So advice for the next generation of engineers, you know, the things that I usually focus on are finding where intuition and analysis each have, you know, so that unique fit to the time and the occasion. You know, if you approach everything analytically, you will move incredibly slow. If you approach everything intuitively, you will hit roadblocks. And I think that, you know, when we're looking at places that don't have the resources of, you know, like an Apple, where you can't just brute force everything, that intuition becomes absolutely pivotal. And I would replace intuition there with, again, craftsmanship. It's that like that just deep understanding and continuing to cultivate that somehow in your career.
Okay. Zach, final thoughts?
Sure. My advice to the new excellent engineers is come work for Backbone, because we're hiring, and anybody else in this room, we're doubling the team. But in all seriousness, it's don't play by the rules that have been set up by everybody else, right? You have to change the rules of the game. You have to take risks if you want to get anything more than the risk-adjusted return on investment. If you don't want to take risks, you should go invest in T-bills, right? So look at what's going on. Go and work for some of these companies that know how to do it and are the best in the world. Learn from those engineers, right, and that incredible talent. And then think of all the ways that you would want to break the rules of the game they've taught you if you weren't in this specific set of constraints that were there. And then go break those rules and do it on your own.
Okay, well, massive thanks to all three of my panelists, and I hope we've given you some historical understanding that sets the stage for Anna Katrina, who's going to talk about the next way. Thank you.